I'm Daphne Crause. I'm the other half. Les has told you his side of the story, and now I want to share my side of the ministry story and how he and I came to get to know each other and got married, etc. So for me, it was a little different from Les's story with regard to the beginning. I was not a Christian for most of my life. In fact, I grew up in the Anglican Church, which you may know is a very traditional church. It's like the Church of England and stuff. They're not Pentecostal at all. They're very staid and things like that. Well, that's all I knew at that time. I grew up there because my father was the organist at that church. And so I used to go there. He would go play the organ for the meeting. I would go to Sunday school and the whole thing. And we learned all the Bible stories and all that sort of thing. But I never knew anything about salvation. I didn't know anything about the fact that we needed to be saved, anything. Anyway, so when I was 14, there were a whole bunch of churches that got together, and we were invited to go to a church camp. And so that's what I did at the age of 14. I went on the church camp, and then one night we sat around a campfire, and one of the women, we were singing and things like that, and then one of the women there gave a very simple gospel presentation, showed a heart that was black, said when Jesus comes in, your heart turns white. And it was really so simple. But she gave an appeal and said, who would like to be born again? And I put my hand up. So that night, at the age of 14, I became saved. Well, I continued at the Anglican Church, didn't just carried on going there. Anyway, a year later, we had another camp. And so I enjoyed the first camp so much. And I went back that time a year later to the camp. And while I was there, two women called me aside the one time and said, have you been baptized in the Spirit? And I thought, I don't know anything about it. So they sat me down, shared what the whole thing was about, and they prayed with me, and I received the baptism of the Spirit, and I began to speak in tongues that day when they prayed for me. In fact, it was quite an experience. I felt like my tongue was moving on its own. And the Lord, it was wonderful. After that time, I felt the power beginning to come over me. I felt more secure in my Christian walk than I ever had before. So anyway, as I continued in the Anglican Church up until my mid-teen years, later on, 15, 16, a little more. And then I started to visit various other churches. I was part of a student Christian association at school, and at times we used to go to other places. And I was introduced to churches that were a little bit more Pentecostal or charismatic, and it was quite a different thing for me then. A little while later, when I was in my around 20, I met my first husband. And we got married when I was about 24, and we were married for about 7 years. And during that time, he was pretty ill, even when I first married him, and it got worse and worse. Eventually, he died. He was a diabetic. And so that lasted 7 years. We had no children. During that time, we were involved in a couple of Pentecostal churches, and I didn't do very much ministry with him at all. He was into youth meetings, and he loved the youth, and he was very good with them. But I really didn't do very much, and I began at that time to have a desire to do more and more ministry. I wanted more. I wasn't happy just sitting on the sideline. So after he died, it was a pretty devastating time for me. And I wasn't sure what the Lord wanted for me. I went through a difficult patch. It wasn't long afterwards, but I thought, I really would like to get married again. And I actually was given a prophetic word by somebody was a church that I went to visit, one of my late husband's relatives. And a woman gave me a prophetic word, and I just knew that this was what the Lord wanted. She said, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desire. And I thought, well, that's what I want. And so I decided to pray then and start to believe the Lord for a second husband. But this time, I decided I really wanted to marry a pastor and go into ministry. That was just my consuming desire and passion. And anyway, about 6 months after I was widowed, I had a Christian boss, and I was at work, and he brought me a magazine and showed me an advert for a Christian singles association. It was a live place where you could go and you could share your desires, and the couple matched you together what they thought you would be a good match for. So I went and I joined up with them, and nothing really happened for a good 2 months or something. I got a few phone calls, but then that was about it. And I was getting a little bit disillusioned. But then suddenly, just after that, the Lord brought Les into my life. He phoned me unexpectedly one day. He'd also joined with them. And the Lord led him to phone me. And it was amazing. As soon as I heard his voice and we talked, it was as though we just connected. And I really felt that the Lord had brought us together. I felt an anointing for the first time that I hadn't ever experienced before. And it was really wonderful. But Satan tried to stop us from getting married because I was attacked. Well, he kind of attacked me the day that I met him, or the day that he phoned. And he tried to stop it, tried to get me to stop my membership of the club. Anyway, we met and we went out to a Christian meeting. And later that night, we came back home for coffee to my place. And the Lord confirmed prophetically to Les that this was of him, that the meeting was indeed what he wanted, and this was his plan for the two of us. So it was a very exciting time. As Les shared in his part of the thing, he was an assistant pastor when we met. And I was really excited about that because I had said I wanted to marry a pastor and go into ministry. So that was very much a confirmation to me as well. And but I was pretty naive about a lot of spiritual things. And because he was in the ministry, he started to pour into me. And for about 2 months, I often laugh and say I had a 2-month Bible study thing, a Bible school training course. He poured everything into me, and I just lapped it up. I was like a sponge. I absolutely enjoyed every minute of it. There were so many things I didn't know. There's so many things that I found exciting, and it was wonderful when he stood there and he sat and shared with me over and over. Every night we'd get together and he would share. And it really was awesome. 3 months later, after our meeting, we got married. And I, of course, had the instant family. He had the daughters with him. And so I had 3 daughters. And I was so excited. I just felt like the Lord had blessed me with every single thing that I had wanted. There was a lot of opposition to our marriage. Somehow, nobody thought it was a good idea. Family members on my side thought that I was being ridiculous, and they tried to stop it as well. You could see that Satan was trying to end this thing before it even started. He was trying to stop it, but it was of the Lord, and that's why I think there was so much opposition to it. So once we were married, we began to learn, we began to pray together in the morning. We both had full-time jobs. We were both working. And so before we went to work, Les and I would begin to pray together. And I loved that part as well. I realized I thought I was an amazing prayer warrior. Before we got married, I would get up in the morning early and I would pray for all the people that I knew who had problems. And I would make a note of what I thought the Lord should do and what he should answer concerning them. And I realized afterwards when Les and I began to pray, but that really was not the way to do it. I thought I was an intercessor. I, in fact, bragged a little bit, said, oh, I'm an intercessor. I thought it was a wonderful thing to do. But realized I was not doing intercession right at all. I wasn't waiting on the Lord for him to tell me what to do. I was deciding myself how the Lord should answer. And so when we learned to pray together in the morning, when we prayed together, I learned a lot. I learned how to see visions, which I realized I hadn't really flown in before. And I learned how to flow together with him. I would see something, he would see something, we would flow together. And I would realize, then we would see the full picture of what the Lord wanted us to pray and what he wanted us to do. And so I really had a tremendous time of learning there. Then about 3 or 4 months after we were married, my desire to be in ministry with my husband came to pass. We had a relative, or Les had a relative, and he had a church, and he wasn't able to run it or something, I can't remember. But anyway, he said to us, would we like to take the church over? I thought, yes, finally my time to get my feet wet in ministry, and I was so excited about it. Well, we took it over, and I discovered, okay, ministry is not moonshine and roses. Ministry is not having people looking up to you and hero worshiping you like I had this really naive idea of. In fact, it was extremely difficult. And I realized, okay, the Lord was still going to use me, perhaps, in this ministry thing, but it wasn't quite what I thought it would be. So we had about 3 or 4 months of that, and then the church kind of folded up, and it was no more. But it was enough for me to get my feet wet and to learn how to minister, to learn counseling things and whatever, and to stand as one with Les. He was definitely the leader, of course, and I was still learning, so I was under him, but I learned a lot through it. About a year after we were married, I finally fell pregnant. I hadn't been able to fall pregnant at all. And I knew at that stage about standing on the word. So I took a promise and I stood on it and saw myself pregnant, saw the Lord healing me of whatever the thing was. And I stood on that word until I knew that I was pregnant. And the Lord answered my desire 2 weeks later. Well, 2 weeks later, Les prayed with me and he saw that there was a blockage. He spoke to it and told it to open up. He saw that my fallopian tube was blocked. So he commanded it to open up. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, I discovered that I was pregnant. And I was ecstatic because I really wanted to have a child. And I felt now that the Lord had really blessed me with that desire. It wasn't a very easy pregnancy. I had to really stand and keep my faith on the Lord. I got diabetes and all sorts of things went wrong. And when I went to give birth, Satan once again attacked. And I had a very difficult birth. And I think he was actually attacking John before he was even born to try and dismantle the thing that the Lord had for him and the blessing that he had. After I had given birth, and after John was born, of course, I didn't work. I gave up completely. So I sat at home, and it was during this time that Les said to me, why don't you get into the Word? He encouraged me to read the Bible from beginning to end, which is something I had never done in my life. I'd always read little patches, but I'd never done it fully. So whenever John was asleep, or there was a time when I had a few minutes to spare, I got into the Word and I read and I read and I consumed it. And I saw pictures of what the Word was about. And every time then at that point, I saw a promise that I liked. I made note of it. I had not an electronic thing in those days. We had a normal paper Bible. So I'd make a note on the page and make a note of the verse number. And then after I'd been through the entire Bible, I began to write those scriptures out on cards, and I began to categorize them. And I built up a resource of 400 scriptures in various categories. And it's been one of the things that I've stood on all the time. It's really been a blessing to have all those promises and to know that I can use them at any time for the Lord, or things that I want to stand on. I also learned to pray in tongues for long times. That I found quite difficult. Les had said to me, you need to pray in tongues for an hour at a time. And so I tried it. I found that a bit difficult, but I managed it eventually. And I learned how to use my authority. And all those things that I learned at that time, the Lord used for me to get into true intercession and really to pray and wait on Him and to get to know what He wanted to do in the earth. So that's the main thing that I did during that time. As Liz worked and while I was at home, I did that intercession a lot. I would pace up and down my garden and do all sorts of things and pray as the Lord was leading me. And I became passionate about intercession. I loved it. It became the thing that I loved the most to do. So every time, whenever I had an opportunity then, I would go and do intercession. And especially when there were difficult times, I would try and pray them through and see how the Lord wanted to move us, the things. Then came our time when we moved to Mexico, as Liz shared. At first, I didn't do terribly much. I still prayed and things like that. But later on, when the prophetic school came into being, my first job that I did full-time was to pray for all the prophetic students. I felt that the Lord wanted me to intercede specifically for that group. And so I did that every single day. I would go sometimes in the morning, often in the afternoon, and I just still loved doing the whole prophetic thing, doing the whole intercession thing. And so I would pray all the time for those students, see if the Lord wanted me to release anything for them or whatever the case was. At that time, I learned a lot about other aspects of prayer, and that's when I decided to write my first book on prayer. At the time, it was called The Way to Effective Prayer. Later on, I wrote the book called Praying with Power, and that I wanted to do something very simple. I hated writers who were technical and who didn't give you, who just gave you technical facts, and it was difficult to understand. And I thought, no, I really don't want to write like this. I want to write simply. And so that was what became the Praying with Power. It was like a handbook on prayer. And there I took 6 categories related to prayer, and I gave a little bite-sized piece of teaching and a bit of application, and built the whole thing up from the ground up. And it became like a true handbook for prayer. And it became quite a popular resource after a while. So that was my 2 things that I wrote at that time. Then after this time, I started prophetic training myself. And that was a very difficult time. It was a very bumpy road. I was up and down all the time, going through emotional things. And the Lord was dealing with things in me that I didn't realize were there. But He needed to refine me and get rid of those things as I went through the prophetic training. And I eventually qualified in prophetic office. And that was, after that, I did a season where the Lord took me through apostolic training and evangelistic. And those were equally as tough, but I managed it as well. And the Lord said that I had qualified in both of those. After that time, I didn't minister that much with Les. The Lord kind of had me on my own path. And He was always doing high-level training. he and his daughter, as he shared, they were pretty much the two that were in charge of the ministry and doing all the training. And he was busy running the ministry. So I didn't really do terribly much with him at that time. And even when we had like seminars and conferences and things like that, I was pretty much in the background. I continued to pray and intercede, but I was in the background rather lifting them up and not doing terribly much on a physical point of view. When people came and visited, I prayed with them every now and again, but I didn't do all that much anyway. Les continued to go through the trainings as he shared, and we were still on kind of separate roads. At that time, I mainly wrote articles. I'd learned a lot about marriage, and learned a lot about ministry things. I thought that our marriage was very good, but there were times when I realized I was doing a lot of stuff wrong. I made mistakes in it, and I had to learn. The Lord showed me what was wrong and how to correct it, and how I could rise up and do what I should do in marriage. And so at that time, I began to write a lot of marriage articles on experiences that I had had, and how the Lord showed me I could change them when they were wrong. After a while of doing that, the Lord, Les encouraged me to start to preach a little bit more. And that was when I began to preach a series on prayer. I preached a series actually on the praying with power. I did that. It was just for a little prayer course that we were going to do at that time. So I preached that. That I found quite, I enjoyed it. I found it quite difficult though. I was very insecure and I wasn't very confident, but I managed to do it. And the Lord got my feet moving with the preaching a little bit more. After that, I did a series that called Addicted to Prayer. That was my first full series, teaching series, kind of like what Les and everybody else had done already. And I used to transcribe all his messages and put them into books. So this was the one series now that I did on Addicted to Prayer. And it was really based on a lot of my experiences with prayer. And the fact, I called it Addicted to Prayer because the first part of it was how I was kind of addicted when we first came over to Mexico. And I prayed all the time, and it was almost like I was addicted. And so that's why I called it Addicted to Prayer. After this time, the Lord brought us back to South Africa, as Les shared. We wondered how on earth we were going to get back because, as he shared, we had a lot of financial problems and we were battling. And I got into prayer and prayed and just asked the Lord to do something miraculous. And suddenly the one day a relative of mine phoned up or wrote to us and said, we want to help you with the airfares and help you come back to South Africa because we believe the Lord is doing something and we know that it's of him. And so that was such a miraculous intervention that the Lord did and a confirmation that we should be back here in South Africa. As Les shared, when we returned into South Africa, he finished doing the teaching on evangelistic, pastoral, and the teaching. And I absolutely loved those series, especially the pastor and the teacher. I suddenly realized I loved being pastoral and encouraging. It became actually the hallmark of my ministry since then. I've always loved encouraging since then. I needed to go through the prophetic training and all those tough things. I needed to rise up and use my authority more. But I can never say that I really felt comfortable being a black and white, hard prophet, dogmatic, telling people this is wrong, this is right. I've always preferred the lower level pastoral ministry. And so I began to do that much more, especially since we came back to South Africa here. Then we moved to the current premises, and Les shared about starting all the prophetic schools, prophetic apostolic, and the business school and everything. And when he was doing the prophetic school, he actually said to me, I need to come and preach and do the praying with power live in the prophetic school. So there, once again, I got my feet wet with a little bit more preaching, and I shared the praying with power at the prophetic class. And that was an interesting experience as well, and I enjoyed it. And then recently it all changed as the Lord led us, and as Liz has shared, he let go of everything, and the Lord changed his mandate. And now finally, after all these years, we are going to be ministering together. It won't be Les on a higher level, me on a lower level, or in the background. It's finally what the Lord has joined us together. It's been 29 years since we've been married. And I'm just so excited about the new vision that the Lord has given, that we're going to be able to minister together. And I know that he has something wonderful planned. I know that this is just the beginning of what he has for us. And that as we continue, we will learn, and the Lord will do wonderful things. So I hope that you will be blessed as Les continues to share what we're going to do now.